So I think a lot of you could use a little bit of help in writing all of these equations for this experiment 10A. So let's look at station 2. I did station 1 on the board. Let's look at station 2. Okay, so in station 2 we've got barium chloride that was mixed with sodium sulfate. So the reactants are written here for you and one of the products. But how do we go about predicting the products and balancing this molecular equation? Well, let's start this way by writing down what these ions are. So this is an ionic compound. It's got barium ions and chloride ions. Remember, in introchem, we always have two ions. There's one kind of cation and one kind of anion. So for barium chloride, we've got a barium ion and we have chloride ion. The 2 here tells us that we have 2 chloride ions. So I'm just going to draw 2 of those. And then we need to indicate what the charges on these ions are. Barium is in group 2A, so it has a 2 plus charge. And chloride is in group 7A, so it has a negative 1 charge. Okay, so those are the ions in that first one. And then let's look at the next one, sodium sulfate. And here we've got 2 sodium ions, Na2, so there's 2 of those, and sulfate, SO4. There's only 2 kinds of ions, so we're not going to split up the sulfur and the oxygen. The sodium is the first ion, sulfate is everything else, and that's going to stay together. So we need the charges on the sodium ions. Sodium is in group 1A, so it has a +1 charge. And then we can look up the charge for that SO4 ion, or we can figure it out by looking at what we've got here. So the formula here tells us there's 2 sodiums for every 1 sulfate. So I drew 2 of those. We know that the charge is +1 on each of those. So we have a total of +2 charge here. We have 1 sulfate ion, and so the charge on that must be 2-. Okay? So predicting products, we're going to swap ions. So barium came with chlorine and sodium came with sulfate, and so we're going to switch it up and we're going to exchange the barium and the sodium. So we're going to have barium with sulfate and sodium with chloride. So maybe highlight them this way. No, that's not what I meant to do. Here we go. So we'll put sodium and chloride together and barium and sulfate together. So over here we've got the barium and the sulfate and sodium and chloride. I'm copying them exactly as they were over here. Barium is a 2+, barium is still 2+. So I just copied them down. Let's go ahead and highlight those. So these 2 are together now, and these 2 are together. So we can look at their charges to figure out what the formula is. For barium, we have a +2 charge, and the sulfate has a -2 charge. So we just need one of each of those, and that's what's indicated up here, just BaSO4. Over here, we've got a +1 charge and a -1 charge, and so we're just going to need one of each of those, and so this is going to be NaCl, one of each. We'll worry about the state symbols in just a minute. Let's balance this equation. So we can look at it up here, or we can look at what we've drawn down here. I think this, if you're having trouble balancing equations, it might be better to look at what's down here. Let's just make a clear line where the arrow is. The arrow is here. That's the separation. So on this side I have one barium ion, and on this side I have one barium ion. So that's good. With the chlorine, I have two chlorines here, right? Because this was BaCl2, so I have two chlorines. And over on this side, I only have one chlorine. I need there to be two. So what I can do then is I can put a 2 in front of the formula for sodium chloride, and now I'm going to have two chloride ions. I'm also going to have two sodium ions, just by adding this little 2 up here. So now I have two chloride ions over there, and I have two chloride ions over there. So that's good. Then I have two sodiums, 1, 2, and now I have two sodiums over here, so that's good. And then one sulfate and one sulfate. So this is balanced now. Now we need to figure out what the state symbols are. Are these aqueous or solids, or what's going on here? To do that, we need to use the solubility rules. So let's look at, I like red better. Let's look for barium sulfate. Okay, so we're going to scroll down here to look for, oops, didn't mean to do that. There we go. So we're looking for barium ion and sulfate ion. And the way we use these solubility rules is we start at the top and we work our way down. So we're looking for barium ion and sulfate ion. So we look in the first row. No, we don't have those. Here, no. Here, no. Here we've got sulfate. So sulfate is in this top half. These guys are mostly soluble, except, so sulfate compounds are usually soluble, except when the sulfate is with strontium, barium, lead, or calcium. Then the compound is insoluble. So here we've got barium and sulfate. And so that's going to tell us that this is not soluble. So we can go back up here and we'll put an S here because that is a solid. It's not going to be dissolved. It's not soluble. Okay, the next one, the other product was sodium chloride, sodium ion and chloride ion. And so again, we're going to look in this table, and in the first row we find sodium ion. Again, these are mostly soluble with no exceptions. All sodium compounds are going to be soluble. So we don't need to look any further. That means that sodium chloride is going to be aqueous. Sodium chloride is table salt, and as we probably recognize, that dissolves in water quite nicely. Okay, so there's our balanced molecular equation. We don't need to put anything here unless the computer requires that, but normally we don't write ones in here, we just leave them alone. The computer in this case is not going to require that you put a 1 in front of that. So now we want the complete ionic equation. So for an ionic equation, we're going to look at those state symbols. If we have AQ for aqueous, we're going to write those compounds as separated ions. And so this one's aqueous, and this one's aqueous, and this one's aqueous. This one is a solid, so that tells us that the barium and the sulfate are not separated. They're sitting together as a lump on the bottom of the test tube. So anything that is a solid, a liquid, or a gas, we're just going to copy down. So BaSO4 solid, not going to do anything to that. I am going to take my BaCl2 and write that as separated ions. Again, it's helpful that we've got our little notes here because this is what is in BaCl2. There's one barium ion and two chloride ions. So I have a barium ion, and we do have to indicate that this is aqueous, and I have two chloride ions. And then we look at the next compound, sodium sulfate, that had two sodium ions and one sulfate ion. So 2 sodium ions, and ran out of space. That's okay, I'll just move that over. So I have room for my sulfate ion. Okay. On the product side, we've already taken care of this one. We just copied it down. This one is aqueous, and so we need to write the ions separately. Again, this is representing what those separated ions would be. So we have 2 sodium ions and 2 chloride ions. So plus 2 sodium ions, AQ, and 2 chloride ions, AQ. There is our balanced, complete ionic equation. To do the net ionic equation, we're going to look and see if we have any ions that appear exactly the same on both sides of the reaction arrow. And here we've got barium 2+ ion over here. Barium is with sulfate as a solid, so that's not exactly the same. Here I've got 2Cl- aqueous, and on this side I also have 2Cl- aqueous. So I'm going to highlight that. Oh, maybe let's make that, I don't know, brown. So this one and this one, those are the same on both sides. Chloride isn't getting involved in the reaction, it's just watching. We call those spectator ions. And then we also have 2 sodium ions here and 2 sodium ions there. They're also just watching what's happening. So those are not going to be included in the net ionic reaction. So we're going to leave those highlighted spectator ions out, and we're just going to copy down what's left. So we've got barium 2+, aqueous, plus sulfate 2-, aqueous, and that's going to give us BaSO4, barium sulfate, solid. And that is our net ionic equation. Hope that helps.